like a model. So I like get in my underwear and like pretend I'm Mike. Yeah, dogs are evil. But seriously, dogs are evil, but they're so cool. Absolutely, yeah. The early skateboarding was just surfing on sidewalks and streets and stuff. The style from skateboarding in the beginning was so surf-oriented that there really was hardly a separation between the two. And the truth is, most skaters, or a lot of skaters in the early days, were surfing when the surf was good, and when it went flat, they got out their skateboard and started skating the streets. Or sometimes they just skated to the beach with their surfboard. You know, classic shots with a skater with a surfboard under his arm heading to the beach. So the two were so intertwined for a lot of years, long time. And the styles were much more like surfing. And I think really when the change happened, that I remember, it was when skate parks started being built. And then people started skating in a whole different way because the terrain changed from street, flat, banks, things like that. First skate parks, the first one that I know of, and it was asphalt and designed like a snake run, a wide, not real heavily banked snake run. And that was designed really to simulate a wave, you know, so skaters could skate and simulate the sense of a wave. I don't know if everybody was fully aware that's why they were doing it, but I would guess they did, but that was a very long time ago. But the earliest skate parks really focused on snake runs. They always had snake runs in them, and that was the best way to get the feel of a wave, you know, carving back and forth. It wasn't so much about kick turns and stuff, it was really about surfing on concrete. And it was a really powerful thing. But then as skate parks started to build pools and banks and other type of terrain, the skating style changed. It wasn't specifically related to things that you would do in surfing. So I think that was, and I couldn't really tell you what year that was in, maybe mid to later 70s, that skaters started skating differently. There was a little bit of a break from the surfing style. And it was neither good or bad. It's just that skateboarding sort of outgrew surfing a little bit and became more of its own entity, where skaters didn't skate to simulate surfing anymore. And more skaters came into it as not surfers. So they brought their own approach to skateboarding just for skateboarding, not thinking about the sensation or the feeling of surfing. And that was another big change in the development of where skateboarding went. It was interesting, once skateboarding became an entity to itself, surfers, in kind of a flip way, surfers started looking at skateboarders, and instead of skaters being influenced or inspired by surfers, surfers started to actually be inspired by skateboarders. And I don't know if that took place in the early or later 80s or not. It was probably a progression that took many years, but it was amazing to start seeing surfers copy tricks, kick flips, and essentially 360 spins on the face of the wave, and air, and things like that I never would have thought would be possible on a wave. So what a tribute to skateboarding, for how skateboarding having its roots in surfing, and then it kind of flips around, and then surfers are now inspired by skateboarders, or at least have been, and there's been tricks that have come out of that, which is a pretty powerful thing. And it also illustrates how tightly bound together, even after all these years, that skateboarding and surfing have been with each other, how tied together that they are, and perhaps still are. I think there's an inspiration there, definitely, but because the early skateboards were typically not long, like a surfboard would be, but I think, you know, pointed noses and some of the shapes of the early skateboards, obviously the people that were designing them were often surfers. So I think there was definitely a, what would I call it, there was definitely a connection there, absolutely. Mid-70s, when skateboarding was starting to take off again, there was definitely much stronger ties with surfing and skateboarding. So the skateboards, I think, at least to some degree, were being designed with surfing in mind, and perhaps I could go one step further and say surfing on concrete instead of on water. I think the graphic, especially with the dog tanners, when Zephyr started, Zephyr skateboards did, and a lot of the surfers started skating on those products, and they were all inspired by surfing. But I think it still took maybe some years before we started seeing some of that maybe in graphics and things like that. Really, the connection had more to do with the skating style than it did with the equipment itself. But there was definitely a connection between the two in the early days. As far as the length of the board, like longboard versus wide boards, freestyle decks, popsicle sticks, penny boards, all of that stuff. I mean, I laugh at some of the stuff like penny boards, but I realize there's a place for it. It doesn't feel like real skateboarding to me, because I think a lot of penny boarders just use them because they can stash them in their backpack and it's easy to get around. So it's really more of a transportation thing, but it's still skateboarding, but it's not something that would interest me personally any more than scooters or roller skates or some of that other stuff. I think the length of the board, longboarding, short boards, the boards have gone through so many changes over the years, from skinny to wide and then back to like medium or narrow again, and it's all skateboarding. And I think really what works, I've seen longboarders out there that can do kick flips and kick turns on the or grind and stuff. The things that I've seen longboarders do is skateboarding, and I actually give them a lot of credit for skating on terrain other than just cruising on the flat. But longboards are definitely much more like surfing because of at least at the cruise. And so to me, I have an attraction to longboards. I've never had one, and I've never really skated on a longboard. But I have a love for longboards just because there's a little bit more style and surf movement in it, which makes it a unique type of skateboarding, but it's still skateboarding, just like somebody who does freestyle or skates slalom or just grinds curbs, skates streets, all kinds of forms of skateboarding. And I think it really comes down to personal preference. Look at all the different board shapes. People cut the nose more pointed, or it's wider, or there'll be like a really steep concave, or double kick, or a single kick. And to me, it's all just personal preference about what works for them, what feels comfortable for them. So I've never made a distinction between different kinds of skateboards in terms of length or width or things like that, because it comes down to personal preference. And in the early days, we used to cut out our own boards. So we were making up our shapes with really not that much of a sense of why we would shape it a certain way. You know, you just sort of cut it and whatever seems to look right. And it was still all skateboarding then, and it's all skateboarding now. It's just a lot more refined with the way the boards are actually manufactured. The surf skate teams, which I'm not really as familiar with, since skateboarding came from surfing, because Zephyr originally had surfers who skated and skaters who surfed. It could be a positive thing. I think it really depends on what the company that has those teams is doing with their teams, whether they're trying to manipulate the natural flow for the skater in them or the surfer in them. That's also a natural progression for the two different sports. I don't like the word sports, but two different activities. Yeah. So actually I think it's kind of cool that they have them. You know, if they give their skaters and surfers the freedom to express themselves the way they want, then it's got to be all good.